Delighted to welcome you today to today's Humanities in Action event. I'll wait till all of our in-house settlement has settled. We are getting, okay, great. Well, listen, this is always a pleasure to be here at Flyleaf Books with you. And, when I was walking here today thinking about today's topic, and our minds like neat dividing lines between things. And when we think about our topic today, we tend to think in these dividing lines about undocumented or documented. We tend to think in these stark terms. The messy reality of lived experience, though, shows us that things are fuzzier and that things are much more complicated. And certainly, as we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about families in which these stark divisions do not exist. What this means for our understanding is how we understand these things has to be deeper, right? We need to use the resources of our scholarship and our observations to get a better understanding of these lived experiences. Through social sciences analysis today, you're going to see we can better understand these factors and what this lived experience is like for the people that we'll be looking at today. And through the humanities, of course, we can bring these ideas into dialogue, reflect on their meaning, and then that'll maybe help us decide on how we act. So that's what the humanities do, and that's why we're here. And for those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Max Orr, Executive Director of Carolina Public Humanities, the public outreach arm for the College of Arts and Sciences, and it's a great privilege to welcome you to this Humanities in Action event. CPH, for those of you who don't know, in our online audience and in our in-house audience, does all sorts of things, including I'll mention some of our other public programming coming up at the end of this presentation today. But of course, we have an extensive K-12 workshops for teachers throughout the states. And of course, we work extensively with our community colleges and libraries throughout the state as well. Before we get into today's talk, and again, I'll have at the end of our session, I'll again mention some upcoming programs and thank some of our sponsors and whatnot. But before we begin, I'm going to ask you in-house to turn off your cell phones or any noise-making devices, vuvuzelas, or those things you used to have when a kid's noisemaker, I think is what they were called. If you brought one of those, you can break it out once. Okay, so turn off your cell phones, silence them. If you're watching on your cell phone out there in the ether, do not turn off your cell phone, and let's get right to it. We're very excited for our speaker today, Dr. Joaquin Alfredo-Angel Rubalcaba. He's Assistant Professor of Public Policy right up here at Carolina. He served 6 years in the U.S. Air Force before earning his degrees in economics from the University of New Mexico, culminating in his PhD as a Robert Wood Johnson Doctoral Fellow in 2018. Dr. Rubalcaba is an economic demographer working on health, well-being, and labor market outcomes of vulnerable groups in the United States, in this case, of course, mixed-status families. He applies demographic techniques to predict immigration socioeconomic status in the U.S. and assesses the effect of public policy on documented and undocumented immigrants and their families. Professor Rubalcaba is particularly interested in the role of public policies such as the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals and the Real ID Act play in the overall socioeconomic well-being of these communities, including their impact on labor and health insurance coverage and other factors. This work contributes to a broader project at the Carolina Population Center that focuses, of course, on how public policy can positively impact inequality, mobility, and well-being. We are very excited for the first time to welcome to Carolina Public Humanities, Dr. Joaquin Alfredo-Angel Rubalcaba. Please welcome as he presents Barriers to First-Class Citizenship Faced by U.S.-Born Children in Mixed-Status Families. Professor Rubalcaba.
Thank you very much, Max, for that wonderful introduction and description of some of the work that I've been doing here at Carolina. Today's presentation isn't a focus on one single project that I'm working on, but a broader digestion of empirical work and the works from other scholars and some of the work that I'm doing currently and some of the work that is being done here at Carolina. And it's, to be clear, while we'll talk a lot about the U.S. immigration system and immigration enforcement, this presentation is not meant to be an indictment of those systems, but rather to understand better the challenges that U.S. born children whose parents or siblings are non-citizens face when accessing social programs, driving to and from school, accessing the labor market, and the things that we do on a day-to-day basis, and trying to develop a better understanding of those outcomes. Oh,
We're just blocking your wonderful face.
there we go. So the first order of business here is just to develop a shared vocabulary. First is, what do I mean by first-class citizenship here? Now, whoops, right here. There we go. Okay, there we go. So what I mean by first-class citizenship is a condition of citizenship as a birthright. So individuals that were born here in the U.S. And the idea or the conceptualization of that first-class citizenship is largely coming out of the civil rights movement, whereby civil rights leaders demanded that first-class citizenship meant the equal rights and opportunities and equal protections under the law, regardless of one's background or identity. Such as race, gender, religion, and in this case, that the household arrangements for those children as well. So throughout this presentation, I'm stating the concept of first-class citizenship for an individual within a family unit. So not just thinking about the child, but what are the conditions within that family unit that could moderate some outcomes as a result of their parents or siblings being non-citizen or undocumented in a lot of cases, okay? Now, the second order of business here is establishing what a mixed status family actually looks like. And throughout my research, one of the couple of things that I'm very much aware of is how complicated household and family arrangements can actually be. And so in this study, we're just going to look at a very simplistic organization of what a mixed status family actually is. But be open to the possibility that these are actually really complex with multi-generational families and parents within a single household, okay? So this is what it looks like. So on the left-hand corner or column here, we have U.S.-born citizens, and on the right-hand corner, we have non-citizens. Now, in a paper with some colleagues of mine, we are formally outlining some of these typologies within family arrangements, and how we are labeling these groups as the fully mitigated, the mitigated, and the unmitigated, where the level or the degree of mitigation is mitigating the impacts of non-citizenship or undocumented status. Oh, it's like a protective factor against like immigration enforcement or administrative burdens within accessing social programs. Okay. So the fully mitigated, if you imagine here, it could comprise of two-parent households or a single-parent household. But the idea behind the fully mitigated household or family is that regardless if it's a single-parent or two-parent household, is that all persons within that family are citizens, okay? And so you can think about it as this group being mitigated from immigration enforcement. Immigration enforcement has no impact on them, right? And also, accessing social programs, traveling, going back and forth to school. There is no consequence or threats on coming from like immigration enforcement agents or the threat or specter of deportation whatsoever, okay? The second category here is the mitigated, right? In this category here, it's designed specifically for two-parent households where one parent is a citizen and the other parent is a non-citizen. So it is trying to make a distinction where there's at least one parent in the household that faces a threat from immigration enforcement or aggressive immigration enforcement and lives under the specter of deportation. So while this fear is looming over the family or the household, there's at least one parent that can help that child navigate the day-to-day societal requirements, right? And then we transition into the unmitigated. Now this is, again, thinking about both two-parent households or a single-parent household where all parents, in this case, are non-citizen, and the only citizen person in that household is that child. Okay, now this is, we say is unmitigated because they're feeling the full brunt or the full force of that specter of deportation and fears of deportation are extremely salient within this particular group. Okay, so we've just kind of described a couple of things here. The first thing is what first-class citizenship is, and the second is how am I defining or outlining what a mixed status family is. But in order for us to have some meaning beyond just these definitions, it's also nice to have a good idea of the size of this particular population. So what I did here was using the American Community Survey as a subset of the census. It's done every single year, of just taking a cross-section of 2019. We're looking at U.S.-born children between the ages, essentially within adolescence, but we're breaking it into distinct age groups. Overall, what we're seeing is that U.S.-born children with at least one non-citizen parent accounts for about anywhere from about 13 to 15% of all U.S.-born children. So that's not an inconsequential number. That's a number that is quite large in the U.S., in the millions specifically. What's also really interesting, and something that we'll talk about a little bit here, is that within these mixed status households, as we define between, or mixed status families, as we define vertically between parents and their children, there's also horizontal mixed status families where you have a sibling that's also non-citizen or an older sibling. So these are families where had migrated at some point with a child, and they had another child in the U.S., so that one child is U.S. born here. And that accounts for about 3% of all of U.S. born children. So that is a 3% of U.S. born children have at least one sibling that is a non-citizen as well. So you can think about this situation in which a household is trying to make decisions about accessing social programs, which schools, where to live, right? Where one child is guaranteed, or at least on the surface is guaranteed, first-class citizenship. But that other older sibling, nothing is guaranteed, right? One child is given the benefit of the doubt in many cases, while the other one may not necessarily, depending on which region of the country that you're living in. So this provides a very interesting and in some cases a very unfortunate dynamic that is constructed at the household as a result of the citizenship that's constructed here. Okay. Importantly, what this mixed status situation does for the U.S.-born child is it essentially forces them to transition or make that transition from adolescence into adulthood at a much sooner age relative to their peers who are living in fully mitigated household where their parents are also citizens. And so what this means is that these children are having to balance just like the regular kid stuff with translating communications between the outside world and their parents, right? Translating, what does this bill mean? Filling out documents for their parents, making medical decisions for their parents, or helping them make medical decisions because there's a language barrier in the doctor's office, and then just in general navigating and understanding society at a much younger and younger age. Interestingly, when we look at the household roster in the census or in the American Community Survey, we see that within these mixed status families, that oldest U.S.-born child is more likely to report being head of household. And so this essentially is underlining that what it means to be a U.S.-born child in a mixed status family in terms of responsibilities and navigating or negotiating the outside world in some of these situations here. Now, what we've done so far in this journey is outline what households, what is the unit of observation that we're looking at? What is the condition? Now, in this part of the presentation, what we're doing is starting, okay, so what are some of the disparities that we see in some of our socioeconomic indicators for these households or for these children that they're experiencing and navigating society? So at the very top here, what you have are U.S.-born parents, right? U.S.-born children with U.S.-born parents. So this is the fully mitigated group. Right, this is kind of like just a demographic characterization for the entire U.S. or U.S.-born children. About 30% live in a single-parent household. about 16% are at or below the poverty line. And about 23% are below 138%. That becomes extremely relevant for U.S.-born children when accessing the Affordable Care or Medicaid programs or CHIPs, that 138% threshold. And then about 4% live without any health insurance coverage. And that's actually in a large part due to the Affordable Care Act and its transition in around 2014 for many states. But when we start to break down into these unmitigated and, or mitigated and unmitigated house or family typologies, focusing specifically on mixed status families, but Hispanic households now, we start to see a stark difference in the conditions in which these children are living. Specifically, we have about 6 million of the roughly 7 to 8 million children in mixed status family that are identifying as Hispanic. And then you can see here that for the unmitigated, they're facing about 36% poverty rate. So 36% of these children are living in families or households where their family income is at or below the poverty line. Okay, so that's what is it? It's about double that of U.S.-born children in fully mitigated households. About 53% are at or below 138% of the federal poverty line, and about 10% do not have any health insurance. So that's double the average of all U.S.-born children in that fully mitigated category. Okay. Let's visualize what this actually means over time. So using repeated cross sections from the American Community Survey, which is a subset of the census, we see these stark level differences between these family typologies, right? So the blue dots represents the fully mitigated. Again, that's U.S.-born children with U.S.-born parents. And then the mitigated, that is U.S.-born children whose parents, or one parent is non-citizen, but the other is a citizen. And then finally, the green triangle here, that is U.S.-born children in unmitigated households where neither parent is a U.S. citizen. And so you can see that the disparity between the fully mitigated and the unmitigated over time is consistently around $30,000 to $40,000 at the household level. So you can start to see that the levels of poverty and disparities are starting. We can see it just in household incomes overall, okay? When we look at health insurance coverage rates, we start to get a slightly different picture here. The Affordable Care Act, right, or also known as Obamacare, really tried to engage U.S.-born children in Hispanic households that were facing this mixed status challenge. But despite those efforts, we still see a lot of misinformation about accessing these programs, and we still see that going from fully mitigated to mitigated and unmitigated, that the gap is still persistent. There was some improvements that were made, but there still is a large disparity between these particular groups. When we look at now, what we're doing here is we're adding in that dynamic of having a sibling within mixed status Latino households, right? And what we see is that when there is a child that is non-citizen, essentially not being able to access affordable or the Medicaid or CHIP program, is that we see that the likelihood of uninsurance for these U.S.-born children it increases, almost doubles in many instances. So we see about 15 to 20% uninsurance rate, and that's despite all the efforts that the Affordable Care Act had made, or the improvements to a lot of families. Now, I often try to situate this within, or contextualize this within my own lived experiences, having twins, and thinking about, well, what if I had one child that was eligible for the Medicaid program and one child that wasn't, and I was at or below the poverty line and couldn't afford health insurance? How do I navigate, well, you get all of these benefits, but you don't get these benefits? I'm not sure what the default would be. I'm not sure exactly what my choice would be, but I know it would be an extremely difficult one in the allocation of resources at the household level among your children, where one is eligible and the other one may not necessarily be eligible. And so what we're describing this in one paper is that policies that establish mixed eligibility within the household, not only in terms of mixed status, but like mixed eligibility and thresholds of income, are going to depress overall or suppress overall participation in some of these programs, because parents are maybe unwilling to navigate some of these hard choices, okay? So what is causing all of this? We see this in the data in terms of health insurance and income, and these are just two socioeconomic indicators that are readily available in public use data. And so what we're going to do here is just briefly go over some of these overlapping systems that essentially are compounding some of these disparities. So the first one is an outdated immigration system at the federal level, right? So think about like what has been some of the major changes in immigration policy. Well, there's been a lot of talk, but really no changes since the Clinton administration. And before that, it was the Reagan administration. So 86, 96 is when we had some subtle changes, or IRCA was one of the biggest changes. And then we have some work responsibility that came later in the Clinton administration. But because of this old system, or old immigration system, right? Politicians on both sides of the argument can agree on this, that the U.S. immigration system itself is outdated. The argument is, well, which side do we actually want to change the policy? And in response to this lack of federal action within the U.S. immigration system, what we've had is state and local governments trying to essentially develop their own policies. So across the U.S., we have a patchwork of policies, right, for essentially a federal mandate or a federal responsibility. And that actually increases kind of like a lot of the unfortunate realities. You think about what's happening in Florida recently, where they essentially were trying to establish like show me your papers laws and be really aggressive for hiring undocumented immigrants. On one hand, you have a strong support, and then once the reality sets in that how this is going to affect the economy, then you have a backpedaling. Oh, that's just political rhetoric. And so, and these are a lot more fluid, right, at the local and county level. Like they're changing a lot more often and being challenged within the court. But the federal system itself is not changing. It's been stable, like I said, since this 96, the Clinton administration. So that kind of lays this backdrop. And then within that, we also have negligence in labor market policies, right? Workers' rights. We have labor exploitation. We have child labor exploitation. Think about what's happening right now in Mississippi, where that 16-year-old in July just recently was cleaning a chicken processing plant and lost his life, right? So we have this situation. And then we have, like, even within immigrant advocates, organizations that advocate for immigration, as well as those that are immigration hawks, organizations that like the FAIR organization, are all trying to construct immigrants as good or bad labor market commodities. I mean, this is part of the narrative that I think perpetuates a lot of these issues, is that we think about immigrants as being good or bad for the economy or labor productivity, but never really are trying to think about that, but then also thinking about the human aspects of these individuals. Like, okay, well, they're going to pay taxes, they're going to work here. So how do we provide support for them so that they can not only survive, but thrive within our communities, right? So that's just one other overlapping system. To add on top of that, we have participation in social programs for U.S.-born children whose parents are undocumented or non-citizen, right? We have extensive administrative burdens that are haphazardly applied across the U.S. So think about Texas and some of states throughout the American South have, it's been documented that they apply aggressive administrative burdens when individuals are trying to apply for social programs. And these are entitlement programs for U.S.-born children. But just because their parents are non-citizen, there seems to be like this additional administrative burden, or at least like this level of suspicion about deservingness, okay? Information is not evenly distributed, right? As an economist, we think about like perfectly competitive markets where information is perfect. Well, this is an example where information is not perfect. Who can and who can't apply is not systematically distributed within these particular groups. And then we have mixed eligibility. This is a concept that we've somewhat talked about how you have one sibling that is not eligible either for income threshold reasons or because they're non-citizen, and then one child that is citizen and eligible. That creates some rub there as well. And then I think the thing that kind of like ties this all together, within this domain here is immigration enforcement, the immigration enforcement strategy as it has developed over time. Now, immigration enforcement strategy is largely set by the federal government and is a mandate through the president. So every time you have a change in presidential administration, you actually have a change in the immigration enforcement strategy. Now, remember, I said earlier that immigration policy at the federal level hasn't really changed, but the enforcement structure behind that has dramatically changed. There's an ebb and flow to this within particular communities, which is often facilitated by local government. So think about here, even within North Carolina, the activation of 287G by local sheriff's departments that quite literally, through investigations were found within like Alamance County to be used to racially profile Hispanics. And so you have a lot of changes and a lot of fears and a lot of reluctance within these households and within these communities because of this immigration enforcement strategy and how it's applied at different levels. So I think that is the reinforcement of these overlapping systems, and a lot of this, of some of the it maintains the power within these other overlapping systems here. Okay, and I'll talk about that as we move on here a little bit. But let's just talk about the immigration enforcement system and what that means for U.S.-born children, for instance. So in 2019, immigration enforcement and removal operations resulted in 165,000 detainee requests with 267,000 removals, with 148,000 administrative arrests throughout the U.S. So these are just like immigration enforcement actions that are occurring at the community level or within American jails across the U.S. And between 2014 and 2018, we know that there were approximately 500,000 immigrants that were deported over this 4-year period. 97% of those individuals that were deported were identified as being Latinos, right? So a country of origin within some country in Mexico or Latin America. 140,000 of those that were deported, right, reported having at least one U.S.-born child. Okay, so, and that's at least one, right? I think on average it's like about 2.5 or 2.3 children. So you multiply that by 2, and then you're going to get how many children are going to be affected over this 4-year period, right? And this is like essentially family separation that has been occurring well before the Trump administration, right? Not just as a result of the Trump administration, but well before as well. Okay, so what does that do to these households, right? Well, from the literature, this is what we know. We know that immigration enforcement and children of foreign-born parents are more likely to face poverty, right? And we saw that statistically earlier. Are less likely to have higher academic achievements. We see increased rates of dropout and grade repetition, as well as a lower matriculation into the university among these as a result of these children, among children of immigrants. And then we have this chilling effect as a result of immigration enforcement, which is essentially depressed social program utilization among these households. So this narrative of immigrants are here to utilize social services is actually kind of a false narrative, because we know that with immigration enforcement that they're less likely to participate than almost any other group as a result of that specter of deportation and immigration enforcement. And so I think we were starting to develop a consensus on some of these outcomes. When we think about immigration enforcement within the labor market, which is a part of a study that we're going to get to right here, is that we see that immigration enforcement has a large impact on labor supply and wages of immigrants. So when there's periods of heightened immigration enforcement, we expect lower rates of labor supply. So that's labor force participation as well as employment, as well as a depression of wages, as well as an increase in violations of workplace safety. So we see a lot more workplace, a study by Grittner and Johnson has showed that during these periods of immigration enforcement, we have higher rates of workplace injuries, but a massive decline in OSHA or reporting violations to OSHA. So we can start to see how immigration enforcement is also essentially depressing any claims that employees would have when there's a violation against them in the workplace. And this is not just workplace safety, but this is also wage theft. This also includes, if we split this apart across gender, this is also workplace violence and sexual harassment. There was a study that was done about 10 years ago now. It was more of a qualitative study on agricultural workers. And what they found was that 80% of the women that they surveyed in California had experienced some form of sexual violence in the workplace. And so that's a large number. I mean, that's almost unbelievably large. But there's other journalistic reporting and documentaries, for instance, The Night Shift, that have documented this very clearly, that women in the workplace who are undocumented or non-citizen are more likely to face sexual harassment, not only from other employees or managers or bosses, but also from customers as well. So from this framework, we start to develop a hypothesis, right? And I'm going to walk us through this hypothesis that we are going to talk about in terms of the labor market outcomes for U.S.-born children in mixed-status families. So first of all, going from left to right, we see that there's an intensification of immigration enforcement, right? There's no doubt we can actually see that over time and from month to month that there is ebbs and flows to immigration enforcement. But that intensification, right, leads to a decline in labor supply among non-citizen parents. This has already been documented by scholars such as Amuel Durantes and Chloe East. Then what we see is that decline in labor supply among non-citizen parents leads to a decline in overall household income. So we have a group that's already at or below the poverty line that, given the ebbs and flows of immigration enforcement, are going to cycle out of the labor market and experience lower wages over time. However, if there's a U.S.-born child, what we hypothesize using the added worker effect from economic or labor economic theory is that labor supply and as a strategy to smooth income during these periods of wage loss is that they are going to send somebody in the household to work during periods of heightened immigration enforcement. But if you're in an unmitigated household where both your parents are non-citizens, both those parents are going to be facing that specter of deportation, right? So who do they send in? The child who doesn't directly face the risk of deportation here. And so what we did is we did a study looking at, does this dynamic actually present itself in the data? So what I'm going to show you next is what we call an event study analysis or an event analysis. There's a red vertical line here. And what the red vertical line represents is the month in which we are observing a change or an increase in immigration enforcement. Think about this as an event that we have identified empirically as an intensification in immigration enforcement. Now, in the blue, in the gray shaded, in the gray shade there, that represents the labor supply for the head of household. Okay. In like the pink or the red, that represents the labor supply of a U.S.-born child within that same household, okay? So when we look at before the event occurs or before the intensification of immigration enforcement, that the patterns they're not responding, like it's flat, which is good. But then once we see that immigration enforcement action occur within a particular month, we start to see an interesting pattern here, is that the child, right, is more likely to go in the labor market, and the head of household is more likely to leave the labor market. So we see empirically that given an exogenous shock in immigration enforcement, that the labor supply between parent and child across this non-citizen, citizen, or U.S.-born non-citizen dynamic is that there's a divergence within the labor supply, which gives us some indication that there's an added worker effect, not just horizontally between parents, but vertically between parents and children. So let me set this in the context of what's going on right now throughout the U.S., okay? So we have a concerted efforts across I want to say about 10 states to actually roll back child labor protections, right? Now we think about this in the context of like, oh, okay, well, yeah, kids should work, right? And some studies have shown that working for like an opportunity, right, like an internship, does have long-term benefits. But this isn't working for, increasing opportunity. This is working to smooth that income during these periods of immigration enforcement, right? Out of like around the 10 or 11 states that have been introducing bills to roll back some of these policies, we see Arkansas, Iowa, New Hampshire, and New Jersey have actually implemented these and passed them legislatively, right? Arkansas, probably one of the most recent ones, had basically eliminated age verification. So employers now, right, are not required, and there is no enforcement for them to actually enforce age verification policies. In Iowa, we see they lowered the age minimum, but something very interestingly is they introduced right now a bill to relax safety standards, and at the same time removing liability for any workplace injuries. So essentially what that does is it removes any civil litigation that can occur to prevent, or that would be a credible threat to make a safer work environment. And so you could pair that with what's happened recently with that young boy that passed away in the chicken processing plant. OSHA is going to great lengths to try to get people to cooperate and testify, but they're having a really hard time. So you think about like, how does immigration enforcement play within this dynamic, right? We can go back here to Johnson and Grittner's paper, right? And we see that workplace safety, right, standards are decreasing, as well as workplaces are becoming more, or injuries are increasing, but at the same time, the complaints to OSHA are decreasing, right? And so what that suggests is that employers or employees are fearful of raising red flags, right, because of their immigration status. So this is like actually really concerning, right, on a broader, because, there are other states throughout the American South that are considering this, right? And you can think about like, where are most of our immigrant families, as being like Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, Utah, right? The American Southwest. But that has actually been changing over the past, 20, 25 years, where you have an increase or like the utilization of this term, the new Hispanic destinations, because they're coming to the American South. They're coming to Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina. Just looking at some of the violations that we know of between 2015 and 2022, we can see that age employment violations throughout. This is like over the entire U.S. And keep in mind the change from 2015 to 2022. You have a tripling of age violations, right? When you think about violations that occur as a result of hazardous occupations, so children working in a chicken processing plant, we see almost like a doubling. You go from about 300 to 600 over this span of time. So this is actually really concerning, right? I don't suspect that these numbers are going to go down anytime soon, given the state efforts to relax child labor protection laws here in the U.S. So, okay, so that's just like one study, essentially, within a much broader program of studies that we're doing, not only here, but across institutions as well, is to start to think about, like, what are the implications of this, but across gender, right? We see that undocumented immigrant men have the largest labor force participation rate of any other group, about 97%, right? Immigrants don't come here to hang out, right? They come here to work, for most cases, right? You think about the economic pull factors. But when we look at undocumented immigrant women, we see that they actually have the lowest labor force participation rate of any other group, right? And there's been like attempts to try to explain this, but I think that it's a lot more nuanced than what we are thinking, how we think about it, right? Think about wage theft, workplace violence, sexual harassment within the workplace, but then you add on top of that is how do I seek justice if I'm a victim of a crime, right? I'm undocumented, so what are the implications? I mean, there's been like the VAWA, or the Violence Against Women Act, that has tried to mitigate that, but then that still requires you to trust a government that is largely, like over the past couple of years, or what is that? I guess since 2016, has largely created a narrative that we don't want you here. So that trust needs to be gained back in a lot of cases here. But not only how these non-market mechanisms may impact this disparity, but how do household arrangements? Who's the head of household, or who, how many children, and how does that also play into this as well? Thinking about health, wealth, and labor, we have a project looking at agricultural organizations that are trying to increase the wages for farm workers, and trying to look at how does that increase in income as a result of these policies, these programs, how has that resulted in public health outcomes? Specifically, how does the money connect to the health and well-being of foreign-born Latino women that we suspect that are living within counties that are, where they're working in agricultural industry, as well as their infant children. So do we see a change or an improvement in birth outcomes among these women as well? So that gives me to a much broader implications of these types of studies, is that the disparities don't just exist in adolescence, but we see evidence that they actually start to exist in utero. So if you're thinking about like the long-term health implications of being a premature baby, right? We can start to see that the disparities are situated before that child is even born in the U.S., right? Thinking about community safety and crime and policing, remember, U.S. federal immigration policy hasn't changed, but the immigration enforcement strategy has, quite often actually. And so one of the strategies over the past 20, 30 years now has been to try to incorporate local law enforcement agencies within the enforcement strategy, right? 287G, secure communities, these types of policies that are essentially trying to take an officer whose objective is to ensure community safety and engage with the community to now operate as a federal agent in a lot of capacities. And so trying to understand how this essentially federalization of local police and sheriffs has essentially led to racial profiling throughout the American South. And then representation. So in a relatively new report, what we're looking at is how does immigration enforcement actually impact how Hispanic and immigrant families are represented within nationally representative data sets. Think about the census, right? Think about how that is a very much important social, economic, and political tool that is used to try to understand where people are living and what their needs are, so that we can allocate resources to those communities, especially those communities that are in the greatest needs. But if those people are, like these families, these communities are underrepresented because of the ebbs and flows of immigration enforcement, right? Then what we essentially are doing is under-enumerating and taking away power from these particular communities. So we're trying to understand, if we can solve, understanding how much is the underrepresentation over time, then maybe we can get better insights into what is the true, impact of some of these policies that we're seeing on a broader scale that don't just get into health, but wealth and other types of social economic outcomes. So with that, that's all I have. I want to thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions from the in-house audience. We'll start with questions in-house. And Paul, I also want to let folks know that you can, if you're watching online, you can use the question and answer button on the bottom of your screen there and put in questions there. Would anyone like to start? Don't be shy.
You mentioned 287G.
Mm-hmm.
What is that?
So 287G is essentially a program that facilitates through a memorandum of agreement the cooperation between Department of Homeland Security vis-a-vis ICE or Immigration Customs and Enforcement to the local law enforcement agency. And essentially what you've had over time are several different models. The first one is called the jailhouse model, and the other one's called the task force model. It essentially allows these deputized like sheriffs or police officers to ask individuals about their citizenship and to run their names against a federal database to see if they're a known unauthorized immigrant, and then recommend orders of deportation for those individuals. So while it seems like in describing it, it seems innocent, right? Like maybe something that maybe a good strategy from a policing perspective. We've seen, and what the concern has been from the communities is that these memorandums of agreements, which requires both parties to agree to it, essentially has been leveraged as a mechanism to target Hispanic communities overall, under the guise of like that Hispanics have a higher level of suspect citizenship.
Okay, I have a question here.
In quite an early slide, I was kind of surprised to see that it looked as if children in unmitigated families had a much higher fluency rate than children in mitigated families.
Yeah, so the fluency is are in a household where neither both parents are facing some issues with the English language. So the fluency is right idea, but it's flipped. Yes, yeah.
Yeah. What are the roadblocks to the undocumented parent, if they're married to a U.S. citizen, becoming a U.S. citizen? So that way you don't have the mixed status issue of having an undocumented parent.
Could you repeat that one more time?
I'm just interested in if you have one parent is a U.S. citizen,
Mm-hmm.
and that means possibly they entered the country legally or they were born here, but they're married to an undocumented.
Mm-hmm.
What are the roadblocks to that undocumented parent becoming a first-class citizen? Besides that, it's a long process.
Yeah, so it also requires, that's baked into the U.S. immigration policy, like the system itself. So first of all, I guess like the natural tendencies to think about undocumented immigrants as, entry at the point of entry, that they are, undocumented. So they're illegally entering into the U.S., right? Or through informal channels, right? But that's not necessarily the case. What we see is a lot of like student visas or temporary visa holders or H-1B, H-2A visa holders that come here as unauthorized but are visa overstays. And so that dynamic is changing as well. So this idea that everyone is like the border wall is going to do anything is missing the point of how individuals cycle into unauthorized status. And it's trying to push people to move beyond the dichotomy of thinking about immigration status as this very rigid thing that you either do this or you don't do this, but it's very fluid. It cycles in and out.
Questions from the in-house audience? Yes, Charlie.
Could you give us a little broader perspective on this, in the sense that undocumented immigrants have been demonized successfully over the past several decades? Even if we could even set that demonization aside, is there a model for a policy that you have some thoughts on that would provide direction and to the number of immigrants we need, what's good for us, what's good for them, and no matter what the policies are, we still have to have some level of control over our borders. But I think this, the child labor laws that are being violated, they're being tolerated because we don't care as much as we should. But they're just, I think, all a part of this larger issue What do we do? What can be done, even theoretically? I would appreciate your thoughts.
I was waiting for that question. Reform the federal immigration system.
Yeah. So I don't have a straight answer. I have a lot of like an economist. Well, on this hand, you have one outcome, and on this hand, you have another outcome. You know, under the Reagan administration in '86, we had IRCA, which was established, right, which offered, in actual, IRCA was designed to address that very issue.
What does IRCA stand for? Will you remind us?
The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. And that was largely designed to address unauthorized immigration between the U.S.-Mexico border that was essentially established as a circular pattern of migration through the Braceros program. So for a very long time, what we had were migrants that would come to the U.S., work, and then go back home, right? Under IRCA, which is try to formalize immigration enforcement efforts, we start to see that not only are individuals migrating to the U.S., but now we have families. And because of the fear of not being able to come back to the U.S. for economic opportunities, then you have individuals that are just staying. So we have an ending of that, and they call that the golden cage, right? Because essentially you're trapped because you fear going back across the border because there's a lot of uncertainty coming back across the border. But with that policy, what we have was one of the compromises was, keep in mind that there was about 4.5 million unauthorized immigrants in 1986. Today we have about, depending on whose estimate you're looking at, anywhere from 10 to 13 million unauthorized immigrants here in the U.S. So under IRCA, what you have was the compromise was, or I guess it was an understanding that it's not feasible to deport 5 million unauthorized immigrants, right? At the same time, what would that do to our economy? So a lot of these questions that you have, right now are some of the questions that we were struggling with in '86. And the result was to provide or offer an amnesty program, right, with some temporary work authorization that would extend while individuals are trying to seek out amnesty, or how that process would go. I think the estimate is somewhere about half of those individuals that were eligible actually participated, maybe a little bit more. But there's a really big trust issue with that. But as a result of IRCA, what we did was we really focused on the flashy side of the policy, which is increasing border enforcement. So you have a huge capital outlay or investment into the U.S. immigration enforcement mechanism or system itself, right, along the border. So you have exponential increase in money, but also line watch hours, the number of border patrol agents. You have some parts of the wall that was being built, think El Paso area. And what we see is that despite the efforts it's kind of almost like the war on drugs, in that we spend more money, but we get nothing out of it. And essentially that's what it was, is because we ended that cyclical pattern of migration and focused on immigration enforcement, which kept a lot of those individuals here. This is like a long story to say I don't have the answer.
We had a question from the online, which is essentially what should legislatures do? And I think you took a very good shot at that.
Yeah.
If you
it's complicated because, I personally am not okay, so first of all, if we have no immigration, if nobody wants to come to our country, then we have a bigger problem than unauthorized immigrants living in our country, right? And I think that regardless of what side that you're on this debate, immigrants do contribute, and a lot of communities and a lot of states are actually the drivers behind economic growth and population growth, right? So think about population decline over time. We're not growing as fast as we used to. Most of that growth is coming from immigrants coming into the U.S., right? So if we just stop immigration altogether, we're in a world of hurt. Innovation, productivity, our economy is going down, right? And I think, how do we address that, right? There needs to be some type of policy, sure, but spending a lot of money on immigration enforcement when there's other ways that we could approach it, I think, right? Like get a lot more creative people than me that understand not only the pull factors here in the US, but also the push factors and the geopolitical climates in their home country, right? To address them with a multi-pronged approach, I think is what is going to be demanded, right? And that's a hard pill to swallow, because if you're a politician, how do you justify spending billions of dollars in Latin American countries? You can't. You can't.
If you'll humor me, a question. You had talked about all these overlapping, this fundamental problem is the federal immigration system hasn't changed. And so there are all these other factors that are interplayed with it. Are there practical solutions within healthcare reform alone, or within labor reform alone, or within housing access alone that you think are politically acceptable to a broader swath of the population in ways that might, if we can't fix the immigration system, at least we can fix the marginal status that we've put some of these communities in through the labor, health, or housing or other markets?
Yeah, well, the Affordable Care Act was an attempt to try to ameliorate the lack of access to healthcare for U.S.-born children, right, who met the eligibility requirements in terms of income, but whose parents were actually facing, undocumented status, right? And matter of fact, there was a memorandum that was issued by the Department of Homeland Security, or I think ICE, that said, hey, we are not going after the information that you put down with HHS or the Medicaid program. We're not going to use that information to enforce U.S. immigration policies. Like, they were trying to make it as clear as possible that these were two different, distinct government agencies, and that one wasn't going to talk to the other or share information, right? And even then, we didn't quite close the gap all the way. I mean, immigration enforcement, right? Aggressive interior immigration enforcement, I think, is probably the driver behind a lot of this, right? And so being creative in how we approach that, I think, is warranted. But again, I don't know exactly. I don't have a clue. I mean, these are very complicated issues that require creative, multi-pronged approaches. There's not a panacea here.
What is the answer to the dreamers, to DACA?
So DACA, I believe,
Which is now closed.
it's done. Over.
It's done.
Yeah.
But what do you do with these people now in their 40s who have been contributing to society but could actually be deported
Yeah.
at any time, and yet they've been paying to Social Security and Medicare and their local economy? Some of them have been very, very successful. They have families. They have kids who are U.S. born.
Mhm.
They're in the worst position.
Served in the military.
Served in the military, yeah.
Yeah. So, DACA was established in 2012 as a result of the failed DREAM Act, right? And it was it was done by presidential order, right? It was a temporary Band-Aid. I think it was a great program when it first rolled out, but I didn't like it. The reason why is because we saw what happened from one presidential administration to the next. It's like we can get rid of these things relatively easy. When something is actually baked into to U.S. law, the federal level, it has some teeth. It has some guarantees. It garners a little bit of trust. I think that so it was like 2.1 million. It was estimated at the time that DACA was implemented that 2.1 million undocumented immigrant adolescents and those who could have been eligible for the participation. But we have a little bit less than half that actually did participate. So it says something about how immigrants were actually looking at that particular policy. And I agree, when you have individuals that were participating in that program, essentially what you have is a huge trust in the federal government to not use that to not just go okay, so the participant has protection. But what about the parents or the siblings, as I explained in this mixed status family situation? And so thankfully that hasn't been used, to the best that we know, right? I don't know. We try to FOIA request that and see, but good luck.
Questions from the in-house audience? Any questions online? I have one more observation and question for you, and it goes back to my previous question. You covered very well about Obamacare, ACA, and the challenges there with that. My observation is just this: when you were talking about labor, I find it disturbing that many Americans are comfortable saying we need immigrants to pick our food and to provide this sort of permanent second-class citizen working class in our country. I guess I want to push you on labor reform. Is labor reform, are there things that, now none of these things, of course, every one of these things we're talking about are incredible hot button political issues, but is labor reform one way to maybe even change the culture in which we accept this and that we guarantee the dignity of all work? And one of the things I've always argued is that these are the jobs that Americans won't take, right? And I say, well, what if we paid all people properly, immigrant, non-immigrant, et cetera? Do you have any comments on whether there are reforms within the labor law that could help mitigate these, not to use that word mitigate, but help these families affected?
Yeah, so I have a long-winded answer to that, and a lot of maybe different. But I think it kind of goes back to, I don't know what slide it was, towards the end, when you have this narrative of good or bad for the labor, the labor productivity of the U.S. And that's on both sides of the argument, because people that are trying to, advocate for immigrants are saying, well, look, they're adding to our GDP, but like not really like getting down like, hey, these are human beings just like you and I. And I think that like it's because the economic capacity of an individual resonates with both sides of the aisle a little bit differently than like thinking about like them as human. And that's very unfortunate in my opinion, that narrative needs to stop, right? Or at least like that point needs to like take a couple levels down, right? Now, there needs to be labor reform around this, right? More labor protections. And there's one organization that I challenge you all to look at, and it's the Fair Foods Program, which has, I think, has provided an innovative approach to advocating for fair wages within the workplace for agricultural workers who are largely migrants. And what they did, instead of boycotting the farmers who, they themselves are facing, long-term investments in capital, right? They take on a lot of debt. Addressing that is actually really difficult. So what they did was they went to the consumers or the purchasers of agricultural products and asked, hey, you have been negotiating for cheaper products, and what that's done is force the employer or the farmer to viciously negotiate for cheaper wages on the farm. Why don't you pay a penny extra per pound or whatever that rate is now? And we will establish a program that provides workplace training and higher wages. And that has actually worked for tomato migrants working in tomato industry. And we're seeing a lot of benefits that come out of that, especially around like organization and labor rights. And I think that, I'm not saying that is a solution, but there also needs to back that up a federal solution along with state solutions as well. Because the federal government can only do so much. It's the state governments that also have to support that effort as well. But farmers have a strong lobby.
Charlie?
Yeah, I was touched by the article in the New York Times Magazine section on poultry processing plants. I think there was one in North Carolina, and you talk about using child labor, where they regularly had young children, 14, 15-year-olds, come in at night to clean the processing plants before everybody else came in to do the work. And there was pretty well acknowledged, according to this article, that, people were aware of that.
Mm-hmm.
One of the fears they had, if they made a big deal about this, was the processing, whether it was Purdue or whomever, or Tyson's or one of those, they would just go to another town. And now you have a small town which is totally dependent on that plant that's basically held hostage. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, if you have one employer that has all the power, right, they're going to leverage that, just like in any, monopoly or monopolistic, those are called oligopolies, right? The leverage is not only placed on the immigrants in terms of immigration enforcement, but it's also placed on the communities to look at the other way, right? In a recent case, OSHA was I don't know the company, but one of the the bosses of this company that OSHA was trying to investigate, or one of the attorneys for the company representing the company, said, "We want OSHA to come through with a bag over their head," and that's the level of access that we're allowing them. Essentially saying that we don't want them to see anything, and it's because the reality is that there are children. Now think about this in the pandemic, right? When we were all locked down, because we feared getting sick, or and you still have the production going, right? The whole entire food industry still working. It needed to work. Like it couldn't stop. We needed it. We depended on it, right? Like we couldn't just not have it. And I think a large part of that was a result of the migrant population, and potentially and most likely those who were children. Sorry, I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer.
1880s, 1860s, 1880s, 1890s in America, again, 1920s, where we've just fallen back into these. It's just a different population this time. It's not Italians, it's not Germans, and not, whoever, East Europeans. This time it happens to be people from Nicaragua, Venezuela, whatever. And so it's just, they're going through the same situation that even my ancestors went through.
Yeah, I mean,
But before there weren't the federal laws. Now you have OSHA, that's a typical agency that's underfunded, undermanned, and really does not have much teeth to really enforce what it needs to enforce. In fact, under Reagan, the poultry guys went to the Department of Ag, allowed them to self-regulate in terms of the speed of the way the processing went through, and the handling of the animals and everything. And so you feel like, well, it's Sinclair Lewis all over again. You need people who are starting to be muckrakers, who sit up there and say, no, you can't have this, you can't do this. And you can't have 14-year-olds working near machines that are going to maim them for life. And then they're expected to go to school. But the kids say, if it's the same article, they're doing it so that they can send money back home. And that's the other issue, is that back home, their parents or the rest of their family, extended family, they just don't have the income because they're living in poverty there.
Yeah. There's been some recent testimony in Congress or the Senate, essentially, I don't know. I don't know exactly the validity of it, but like Health and Human Services essentially calling, or whistleblowers within the Health and Human Services calling attention to the fact that the government is the middleman now, or is operating as the middleman for essentially for human trafficking of children laborers. And so that's also concerning. But maybe, right? The bureaucracies are really hard to change, I think. But here's the reality: is that not only are these children that are that face kind of skewed power dynamics in terms of employer relations, right, and just in society, but they're also fearing deportation too. So I mean, think about that as like the bullwhip, right? Like, hey, I could just call ICE if you don't want to get in line, or if you want to talk to OSHA, that's fine. We'll call the sheriff, or we'll call whoever to come in. That relationship hasn't been fully interrogated or explored, but I imagine that's probably what's going on in a lot of cases. But so we're doing a lot of research on trying to, or not just me, but a lot of people have worked in this space of trying to understand what are some of the disparities and the unfortunate realities. A new line of research is trying to understand, so what are some of the policies that have been working, and how can we scale those, or how do we imagine those differently at a federal level potentially? So looking at what are some of the impacts of the Fair Food Program on the public health outcomes of foreign-born Latino women, or looking at sanctuary county policies. How have those worked to work? And surprisingly, sanctuary counties, or at least preliminary findings, suggest that within the first couple of months of a sanctuary county being established or city, is that there's actually a decline in some of the outcomes. So a negative impact on health and well-being because of retaliatory conditions from ICE, because the city or the county is trying to sever the relationship with Department of Homeland Security. And we see right after that sanctuary policy is implemented, that there's an increase in ICE arrests. So they transition the enforcement from, detainer requests that occur within county jails to now actually going out into the community and not just arresting maybe one individual, but maybe family units together.
Okay. Charlie?
Try one more question. Do you have any political allies for the work you're doing?
I'm in this realm. I try to stay apolitical as much as possible.
Do you have any support with any government agencies who are looking into this? How do you operationalize the things you're in your group are learning and doing? How do you advocate for it to put it into effect?
Yeah, there's a couple of organizations, like nonprofit organizations, that use our work to help inform policies. But that's as of right now, this is kind of as far as we've gone right now.
Any questions from our online audience? Okay. Further questions? Any questions in the house audience? Well, let's put our hands together for Dr. Rubalcaba. I'm going to just give a few quick updates about what we're going to invite you up to say goodbye one more time. And so thank you. Excellent talk. I started out saying, just talking a little bit about how we need to see through these stereotypes and see through these blocks, and I think we certainly got that. Information sometimes can overwhelm us, but we need it, and absolutely it shows us just how complicated this issue is and all of the overlapping, just like you said, the overlapping systems. But excellent talk. I want to again thank one more time. Let's thank you for this wonderful talk. Well, I want to thank our sponsors, the Cotton Baumberger Group at Morgan Stanley, the North Caroliniana Society, both of whom really help support our K-12 programs. We're so thankful for their support. I want to thank Carolina alumni for their support as well. And of course, to put our hands together for Flyleaf Books, an independent bookstore. A true sign of civilization is a fully functioning independent bookstore. And of course, our lovely CPHF, Beth Gardner and Paul Bonici. Thank you so much. For folks, we have, of course, Humanities in Action continues next week. Beth, who do we have next week? Beth is going to give me my cheat sheet here. We have, I'll get that in just a moment, but we also have some other programs coming up. One that's actually on Saturday, December 2nd. Thank you, Beth. One that's Saturday, December 2nd, which is related, is called Modern Civic Life and Public Health Across the Americas. And we're going to be looking at public health, in particular women's health in Latin America, as well as here in the United States among migrant communities. So a related topic on Saturday, December 2nd, and that is a two-speaker with Ana Maria Silva-Campo and Laura Villa-Torres. Should be an excellent. So if you're interested in these topics and digging down a little bit more into them, both throughout the Americas, that should be a wonderful event, and we urge you to sign up. Our next seminar is coming up. We have a seminar on the late Roman Empire coming up on October 28th, and a seminar on opera coming up on November 18th. So go to humanities.unc.edu and check that out. Next week we have yes, Christopher Clark, wonderful speaker from the Political Science Department, is going to be talking about it's got a very basic title, Black Women in Politics, but he's going to be talking about the last 5 years and the growth of Black women's influence in Congress as well as in state legislatures and whatnot. So check that out, especially considering our new senator from California is right on topic there. Of course, we have other topics coming up. Update on poverty. We're going to be looking at AI, democratization of AI. We'll have an environmental talk on the rights of nature, and of course, looking at abortion laws and their changes since Dobbs. I want to also draw your attention, folks, folks to the last Wednesdays of every month here at Flyleaf Books, we switch it up and we do a music program. We have the incredibly talented Dawn Landis joining us to highlight her recent work as well as have a discussion about her career in music. You don't want to miss it. Come on up one more time. We'll put you on camera so we can say goodbye. Please thank you one more time to Dr. Rubalcaba for the excellent presentation. We thank you all for joining us. Please go to humanities.unc.edu, line up, sign up, get involved. We'll see you next time.